too many in the 99%. Capitalism, like the love of money, has indeed become the root of all evil and most of what's wrong in Homo sapiens civilization today. But no less than finding a cure for cancer, finding a cure for capitalism won't be easy and could turn out, like chemotherapy, to be as life-threatening as capitalism itself. Indeed, for those who survived, the most common form of liberation from prior Homo sapiens civilization collapse was the collapse itself. But that might be a risk Homo sapiens simply can't afford not to take. What exactly would Homo sapiens gain should it end up driving itself and 4 billion years of evolution to extinction? On the other hand, what exactly would Homo sapiens gain if it does not drive itself and 4 billion years of evolution to extinction? When thinking about these questions, bear in mind that while all of humanity could go extinct in a mass extinction, it is just 1% of humanity, possibly less, making the decisions that have resulted in what scientists are now calling the 6th mass extinction. What exactly would Homo sapiens gain if it is one of the species lost in the 6th mass extinction? Whatever those gains would be, not even those who would benefit the most could take issue with the paraphrased words of Matthew 16:26. What good will it be for one to gain the whole world, yet forfeit one's life? What would one give in exchange for one's life? To put it in capitalists' terms, what will the opportunity costs be to achieve those gains? Is anything worth more than one's life? Indeed, nothing will ultimately matter if all Homo sapiens, and especially the 1%, like all prior hominins, were to disappear into the dust of time. Or, to quote Job chapter 7, verses 9 through 10 of the New Living Translation, "As a cloud dissipates and vanishes, so those who die will not come back. They are gone forever from their home, never to be seen again." Indeed, to paraphrase Jan Zalesiewicz, when seen 100 million years or so from now, from the perspective of some future prospecting Ferengi geologist, the pickings from Homo sapiens' time on Earth will yield nothing more than a paper-thin layer of worthless dust in the rocks. And here is the irony of capitalism. If everything Homo sapiens gained from driving itself and 4 billion years of evolution to extinction amounts to nothing more than a thin layer of clay in the rocks 100 million years from now, what exactly would we have traded for this tidy sum? The lives of all Homo sapiens and of innumerable species on the planet. Would it have been worth it? Given such an outcome, one can't help feeling the Ferengis have made out better than the Homo sapiens capitalists, as in the Star Trek universe. Far from being a thin layer of clay in the rocks of eternity, they are a thriving intersolar system species. But wasn't that supposed to be us, the Federation? An interstellar alliance of more than 150 planetary governments spread out over 8,000 light years in the Star Trek science fiction franchise? And the flip side of that question, what will Homo sapiens have gained if it doesn't drive itself and the rest of the planet to extinction? Besides the obvious and not so shabby benefit of remaining alive, along with all the possibilities that holds, there are other significant opportunities and possibilities that simply would not otherwise happen. To escape extinction and survive not only means Homo sapiens survived past the point of self-extinction and developed strategies for evading existential threats hurled its way by the universe, it implies it also attained evolutionary maturity. And that would be no ordinary accomplishment, because as far as anyone knows, no other intelligent species has ever survived long enough and matured enough to get past the point where intelligent species apparently do something that is decidedly unintelligent, drive themselves and their worlds to extinction. After multiple mass extinctions, surviving would be a first not only on planet Earth, but also in the solar system, the galaxy, and possibly the entire universe. An accomplishment just by itself, and would be worth more than any potential earthly achievements. But Homo sapiens would miss it all if it were to go extinct. Moreover, if Homo sapiens manages to evolve into a mature intelligent species, with strategies to evade the universe's existential threats, evolution would have finally evolved a species, other than bacteria, capable of doing what the dinosaurs and no prior complex animal species could: survive in a universe beset by birth, life, and death. But the jackpot is yet to come. There is hardly anyone I know or hear from who doesn't experience some excitement each time astronauts make it into space, or who doesn't follow with anticipation any progress that hints at a time when Homo sapiens might migrate and spread a mature version of human civilization to other planets or moons or solar systems in the galaxy. We have mused about and dreamt of a life beyond Earth's gravity, explored the possibilities of such a life in innumerable stories, attempted to envision such a life through movies. But none of these dreams or aspirations will ever materialize were Homo sapiens to drive itself to extinction, or fall victim to one of the universe's existential threats or cyclical mass extinctions. In the movie Star Trek: First Contact, set in the 24th century, Jean-Luc Picard and the Enterprise follow a Borg cube back in time to discover that in an earlier century, Earth's inhabitants are no longer humans, but had been assimilated into the Borg collective. The Enterprise must then go even further back in time to undo the damage. Fortunately, that was just a movie, but it's one that might still turn out to be somewhat prophetic. If Homo sapiens end up assimilating themselves into the dust of eternity by self-extinction, without any help from the Borg, our future won't be waiting for us as it was for Picard. If, however, Homo sapiens were to mature and survive past the point of self-extinction and reach that survival plateau, the odds would be quite high that enough time would have passed to also invent the technologies and innovations necessary to begin to go boldly where no Homo sapiens has gone before, to migrate and establish Homo sapiens communities on multiple moons, if not planets, in the solar system, and be well on its way to achieving intersolar migration. More importantly, Homo sapiens would become the first intelligent species to have the honor and opportunity to begin the spread of mature intelligent species life across the galaxy and beyond. But as wonderful and exciting as it would be to see these dreams become reality, none of it would be possible without Homo sapiens' efforts to become a mature intelligent species. Among all the efforts required for Homo sapiens to transform from a seafaring to a spacefaring species, none will be as challenging as the effort it already has begun but must continue to put forth to transform itself from a basic, instinct-driven, tree-hugging, ape-like creature on all fours to a bipedal, erect, intelligent, self-aware species struggling to exercise its freedom to choose maturity and survival over extinction. If Homo sapiens were to escape, or manages to slow and eventually survive the sixth mass extinction already in progress, that would be possible only because, as an intelligent species, it made, perhaps just in time, that fateful choice to mature and survive. Homo sapiens, on behalf of the genus Homo, would have won the evolutionary game of life. But if Homo sapiens fails to survive, sadly, no one would be left to write its epitaph. Few, if any, get to write their own epitaph, and for sure no prior hominin species wrote theirs. If you were the last Homo sapiens standing, what would you write? Here are my thoughts. What are yours? Ode to a once intelligent species. Could even the saddest lamentations of a Jeremiah utter the ineffable grief and ire for a species that would have traded its time in eternity to mine the earth in brief obscurity? What could possibly have been so indispensable, seemingly more invaluable, to an intelligent species so eligible, than the opportunity to mature, survive, and migrate across stars so innumerable, to spread mature intelligent life throughout a galaxy as yet so incomprehensible? How could the decimation of Earth's flora, frowning on its fauna, laying waste its ecosystems, enclosing its habitats, and enslaving and exterminating innumerable members of its own species, have seemed more valuable and desirable? What evil alien invaded Homo sapiens' breasts? What horror, what gross insanity became his quest? What insatiable spirit of greed, of growth and blindness drained dry its heart of the milk of human kindness? Why didn't we care? How could we have kept going when the signs were so clear and the road worn and threadbare? Few indeed really cared to know whether fortune and fame were the best rows to hoe, for it had become the only way to go, so every man ended up heading for that rainbow. So like Serengeti wildebeest they plunged headlong, seeing only the green grass on the plains beyond. But alas, like wildebeest, they plunged into wide, waiting jaws, and the only grass they got was already in the crocodile's maw. Alas, it's done. Alas, no more morning sun. Alas, alas, Homo sapiens' end would have come. This chapter reflects on the history of mass extinctions that has plagued life on the planet and in the universe, and notes that until the sixth mass extinction, already in progress, none has included the extinction or potential for extinction of an intelligent species. More importantly, and until the emergence of modern Homo sapiens, none appears to have been triggered by an intelligent species. But if it turns out there is still time for Homo sapiens to change course and reach that survival plateau, what might it do to get there? In the final section, we explore what might be keeping our species from making that U-turn and present a potential path it might choose to get there. Part 5. Going back to the past to save the future. From civilization to equalization. If civilization is what Homo sapiens calls the nearly 10,000 years since the transition to agriculture began, when we started to live outside of the Earth's ecosystems, then equalization might not be too far-fetched a term for the 3 million years prior to that, spent as hunter-gatherers living inside Earth's ecosystems. And from everything we have seen so far in this book, the road to Homo sapiens' survival points not to more civilization, but to a return to equalization. Homo sapiens must return to living within the Earth's ecosystems if we hope to survive. Should that turn out to be the case, then Homo sapiens, like Marty McFly in Back to the Future, might have to return to its past to discover its future and save itself from self-extinction. Yet even after going back to the past to discover its future, Homo sapiens must be free, willing, and able to choose survival over extinction. But that is not going to be easy, as we will soon see. In this final section, we explore the challenges we might yet have to overcome to avoid self-extinction and survive. Chapter 15. Freedom to choose survival versus extinction. Has Homo sapiens lost the ability to choose? All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you. Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. Inevitably, at some point during its evolution, an intelligent species will be confronted with at least one existential threat, and it must be free, willing, and able to choose to survive to avoid extinction. Facing and making this choice as a species will not only be the most important conscious choice it will ever have to make. More importantly, it might actually be the sole reason for its existence. Failing to choose to survive wouldn't merely be choosing to fail, but a choice to go extinct as a species. Imagine how different the history of our species might be if 70,000 years ago, our forebears migrating out of Africa had come to the same fate as thousands of modern Africans fleeing war, famine, and lack of economic opportunity do today, ending up in the waters of the Mediterranean Sea or in migrant camps in Libya and Europe. What if those early humans making their way out of Africa to escape the ravages of climate change on their habitats had perished in that Red Sea crossing? What if they had been thwarted by a competing tribe or another species, robbed of what little they carried, their women raped, their children slain, and their men tortured, murdered, or worse, enslaved? Thankfully, they must have made it relatively unscathed, because among that small band of early African migrants was the mother of all living human beings. You and I would not exist today if she had not made it. The most difficult choice an intelligent species will ever have to make is the choice to survive, and our forebears made that choice. They were free, willing, and able to migrate to survive what might have been near certain extinction. With them, our entire species would have disappeared. 70,000 years later, modern humans, their descendants, are once again confronting this choice. Unlike their forebears, Africans today have lost the freedom to migrate to survive, the last step in the evolutionary survival pattern of adapt, innovate, mature, and migrate. And when that is lost, all that is left is death and extinction. Africa is where our species began. But what began in Africa did not remain in Africa, and the loss of freedom to choose to survive in the face of the numerous threats playing out across Africa today will not remain in Africa either. Indeed, according to a Freedom House report, across the planet, Homo sapiens are facing an increasing loss of freedom, with 2018 being the 13th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. People everywhere are beginning to realize just how little freedom we have left to take decisive action in the face of existential threats to our survival. Unless one identifies as a member of a minority, there's seldom reason to pause and reflect upon, if not feel, how unfree Homo sapiens have become, even in today's so-called free societies. And, as we will soon see, compared to our hunter-gatherer forebears, modern Homo sapiens have lost most of the freedoms they enjoyed for all but the last 10,000 years of the more than 3 million years of our species' existence. Where do you come out on the following potential existential issues? Should the potential survival of an entire emergent intelligent species depend on the choices of a few individuals, such as Khrushchev and Kennedy, or Kim Jong-un and Trump, and whether they decide to use weapons of mass destruction? Should the decision to turn away from fossil fuel-driven global warming be the choice of one man against the will of the world, or of political and industrial leaders against the will of the people who will die because of it? Should the pollution, poisoning, and destruction of Earth's food chains, atmosphere, flora and fauna, habitats and environments, which put at risk the survival of all members of our species, be controlled by political parties that prioritize ideology, campaign funding, and re-election over what's good for the people? By multinational corporations and their shareholders who prioritize economic growth and profits over life and a sustainable environment? Or by international organizations that prioritize free trade over the environment and capitalists' outcomes over the ability of debtor nation-states and their peoples to survive economically? Is survival of greater value to an individual and our species than profits? A sustainable habitat more important than nuclear power, oil, gas, or coal? Evolutionary maturity more valuable than life-destroying technologies and innovations? If, after pondering the above questions, one feels these issues are potential existential threat-level choices that are being made every day by just a few, the outcomes of which affect and can engulf us all, one needs to ask if we still have the ability to choose to survive over all else. How have we become so powerless, so seemingly unable to choose and implement what we believe as individuals, but more so as a species, to be best for our survival? How is it that, like wildebeest thundering across the Serengeti, seemingly unable to change course as they follow the few into the waiting jaws of monster crocs, we, too, seem so powerless to change course? Have Homo sapiens been struck by a wildebeest phenomenon? Freedom and ability to choose at the individual as well as the species level are closely aligned with the ability and willingness of a species to rapidly change course in the face of potential species extinction events. However, it is becoming increasingly and distressingly common for the wishes and desires of people or peoples to be swept aside by the heads of so-called democratic states, dictators, strongmen, terrorists, militaries, multinational corporations, and international organizations. And it is this replacement of individual and collective choice with the choices of a few that places survival as an individual and as a species at risk. And we have already seen the increasing likelihood of self-extinction when those making the survival versus extinction choice are reduced to just a few individuals. Just as species continuity is assured by individual members' freedom to choose to reproduce, so a species' survival might depend upon the freedom of each individual in that species to choose survival over extinction. And to ensure such choices are not made on behalf of an entire species by a mere few, freedom to explicitly choose, individually and collectively, becomes indispensable to survival. But a lot seems to have happened to curtail that freedom to choose over the last 10,000 years, and in the 21st century, it's beginning to look like the freedom enjoyed by our hunter-gatherer forebears, the ability to choose to survive, both as individuals and as a species, may have become severely compromised. Indeed, our built-in desire to survive as individuals, and our freedom to choose survival over all else, even if that means becoming a goody-two-shoes species and choosing evolutionary maturity, may well have been hijacked, perhaps a bit at a time at first, but increasingly during the last 2 centuries, by, among other things, the technological, industrial, religious, economic, and political choices made mostly by a few. So if it were to come down to a choice between survival versus extinction, does Homo sapiens still get to choose? Or will that choice be made yet again, in spite of its wishes, by the few? By now, you are probably wondering how our species got to this place, and who the hell is the few who seem to keep hijacking our right to choose. That's the subject of this chapter. A useful way of thinking about Homo sapiens' history is to reflect on how often and how close we have come to losing that freedom. To answer these questions, it helps to go back and reflect a little on how Earth life evolved over time, and how Homo sapiens in particular, since migrating out of Africa, has chosen to survive. Among the many metaphors used to characterize Earth life, few capture its essence as completely as likening life to a game of survival. All Earth life can be thought of as engaged in a deadly struggle to survive. It's a game in which winners survive and go on, and losers die and go extinct. It's a game that all evolutionary species, intelligent or not, by choice or driven by instinct, are playing to win, and it's one our forebears, who began with the genus Homo, were playing long before Homo sapiens appeared 300,000 or so years ago. All species play this game by living out their time continuously engaged in adapting to their habitats, innovating and maturing within those habitats, and when those habitats become unsustainable for any reason, must be ready to migrate to another habitat to survive. If they can't or won't, they will go extinct. You may recognize from prior chapters this continuously repeating set of activities as the pattern adapt, innovate, mature, and migrate to survive or go extinct, or AIMMSE. That appears to characterize the life cycle of all Earth life, as in Figure 9.1. In this game, species that manage to mature and migrate survive and go on to face increasingly challenging habitats, at each stage becoming increasingly mature, while those that fail to do so, regardless of their adaptations and innovations, go extinct. The continuously repeating pattern of this set of activities, with its continuously increasing levels of difficulty required to survive in new habitats, appears to exhibit the characteristics of a maturity model, named a species survival maturity model, because it seems to characterize the life cycle of species over geologic time, from their evolution to their survival or extinction, and in the case of intelligent species, their survival past the point of self-extinction to evolutionary maturity. Intelligent species, we noted earlier, that avoid self-extinction are said to have reached the survival plateau, that point in their evolutionary journey where they can no longer drive themselves or other species to extinction, as illustrated in Figure 12.2. Throughout this game of life, this evolutionary journey we have been exploring, there has been an underlying assumption that all species possess both the freedom and ability to choose survival over extinction. Non-intelligent species instinctively adapt and or migrate, or they go extinct. Their abilities to adapt fall within a limited range of capabilities hardwired by evolution. Intelligent species, on the other hand, evolved with the ability to choose, and must therefore first learn how to adapt, and, in addition, can choose even the type of adaptation. Some of these choices we saw in the chapter on adaptations. Given the will to survive is in all evolutionary species, whether by instinct or by choice, having both the freedom and ability to adapt, innovate, mature, and migrate to survive is a qualifying evolutionary prerequisite and is indispensable to a successful outcome in this game of life. Irrespective of the comparably prodigious abilities and achievements of intelligent species to adapt and innovate, absent either the freedom or ability to choose to survive, extinction becomes inevitable. And as important as Homo sapiens' role undoubtedly is in this survival game of life, the outcome may not be all about us, as we seem inclined to think, but might encompass an even greater goal. As this survival game of life unfolds at the species level in the foreground, in the background, at a galactic or even universal level, an even greater game is taking shape. It is a game one can easily miss because of our anthropocentric focus. Playing out over geologic time are the seemingly untiring efforts of evolution to evolve a kind of life that can survive despite the universe's untiring, though equally inadvertent efforts to destroy life. Intelligent species might be one evolutionary solution to this problem of random extinctions that may have defeated previous attempts to sustain life, and perhaps even the survival of intelligent life in the universe. For the first time on Earth, it would seem, evolution evolved an intelligent species with the freedom and ability to choose its own evolutionary outcome. One that might be able to adapt and innovate ways to escape or defeat the universe's existential threats, such as the one that took out the dinosaurs. But for this evolutionary scheme to work, this species, like Homo sapiens, must be able to do what the dinosaurs couldn't. They must first want to survive, and secondly, when faced with an existential threat, as the dinosaurs were, must remain free, willing, and able to choose survival over extinction. As stated at the beginning of this chapter, facing and making this choice to survive will not only be the most important choice an intelligent species will ever have to make, but it might well be the sole reason for its existence in the first place. Failing to choose to survive will be a choice to go extinct. It's probably a safe assumption that pretty much everyone wants to survive. But if escaping existential threats to survive will always depend upon an individual's and/or a species' freedom to choose, then it begs the question, is 21st century Homo sapiens free, willing, and able to make such a choice given the existential threats it now faces? It seems more and more as if that decision at the individual level, and increasingly at the species level, is in grave doubt. It is with this game of life in mind, and this inescapable choice evolutionary intelligent species at some point in their evolution must make, that we explore in this chapter. Given the known potential existential threats, has 21st century Homo sapiens simply lost this freedom and ability to make that choice to survive? As noted above, one way to think of Homo sapiens' evolution and history is in terms of how we seem to have been slowly losing our freedom to choose, sometimes exchanging it voluntarily, but mostly by having it hijacked by what we think of as civilization and the accompanying technological, religious, economic, and political choices made by the few. But it has not always been that way, and for perspective, one has to look back. It is incredibly difficult to envision, given today's world, how insanely free our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived. The lyrics of the song Born Free hardly do justice to what their lifestyle was like. From almost any perspective, comparing their lifestyle to the lifestyle of 21st century Homo sapiens, beginning with the basics of food, clothing, shelter, education, jobs, transportation, and healthcare, then moving on to savings, retirement, leisure and travel, and quality of life issues, and more. The lifestyle of our ancestors would seem to be not only the preferable lifestyle, but also one that preserved at all times and in all aspects the indispensable freedom and ability to choose. The life of the hunter-gatherers was a way of life scientists have begun to characterize as the last great Homo sapiens society. In a 1966 lecture, anthropologist Marshall Salins called it the original affluent society, a view subsequently explored by James C. Scott in his book Against the Grain. It was a lifestyle most baby boomers would wish they'd had, and one most millennials and Gen Xers would no doubt go for in a heartbeat. The following are a dozen of these essential freedoms hunter-gatherers had that Homo sapiens today appear to have lost. Freedom to choose to be, well, free. Hunter-gatherers were free to do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, without getting anyone's permission. They chose to hunt and gather for a living and not to work for any boss. Not that there were jobs then, but from what is known of surviving hunter-gatherer communities, given a choice, most will not. They did not work for any company or government, or to serve and fight for any ruler, king, queen, god, or religion. That, by the way, is apparently how evolution intended it, as all other species still continue to live this way. Imagine what might have comprised a typical week, noting their absolute and complete freedom. They chose how, when, and where they would spend their time, and that only began to vanish when working for the man became de rigueur after the advent of agriculture and settled communities. They were completely self-directed, and obtaining the food and materials they needed occupied only a small portion of their day, 2 to 3 days a week, and required less than half the group of 50 or less to engage in these activities, leaving huge amounts of time for leisure and ceremonial activities. There may not have been many stay-at-home moms either. Among some groups, women are believed to have brought in twice as much food as men. Hunting, done mostly by men, might have contributed less than a third of their diet, and some meat might have come from scavenging animals killed by other predators. There were no jobs, no employers, and for some, the best part, no bosses either. You might say they were self-employed when looked at in today's terms. Hunting and gathering to extract the necessary sustenance they needed from the environment was a highly stable, very long-lasting way to make a living. For hundreds of thousands of years, until about 10,000 years ago, it was the only profession Homo sapiens had known. They independently chose how, when, and where to hunt and gather to sustain their lives. Then came the loss of those freedoms. First, they lost the freedom of how to make a living, going from hunting and gathering to farming. Next, they lost the freedom of when to make a living, going from only a few members of their group working a few hours a day, 2 to 3 days a week, to most members of their group laboring from dawn to dusk, 6 to 7 days a week. Finally, they lost the freedom of where to make a living, going from choosing where to hunt and gather to farming in a fixed location. Here is when enclosure of land, animals, and soon, of people began, and Homo sapiens has not regained these freedoms since. Indeed, working for the man turned out to be a lot more than just switching to a new way of making a living. It meant trading away most of the free time hunter-gatherers enjoyed, and their freedom to choose how and where to spend that time. Instead, they signed on to a dawn-to-dusk obligation to be in a certain place at a certain time to do the same repetitive, boring, often back-breaking tasks over and over again for a meager wage that was taxed, tithed, and often not enough for a family to live on. While hunter-gatherers needed to find food, they most likely wouldn't have gone back to the same patch of land every day, the way one goes to the same office, factory, or shop every day. They did not commute to and from the same locations every day, along the same roads, seeing the same landscapes, buildings, and towns. Going home did not necessarily mean going back to the same address every day, as they moved 2 or 3 times a year, to a completely different area with a completely different landscape. And with each move, they didn't have to worry about getting the kids into new schools, changing their driver's license, or finding a new employer. Living and working in the same city, state, and country all of one's life, traveling only to a few different parts of the world, and only if you can afford to, would not have been their experience. They spent their entire life going from place to place and got to see a lot more of their world than most of us today might ever get to see of ours. Indeed, not until one retires or becomes independently wealthy can one hope to experience anything remotely resembling such freedoms, if ever. Freedom to be economically independent, to be free from money, capitalism, and the profit motive. Economic freedom and independence had been the native state of our species for all but the last 10,000 years of its more than 3 million year history. Economic freedom through hunting and gathering is the evolutionary model for making a living from the ecosystems of the earth, and except for modern Homo sapiens, is still the preferred method practiced by most surviving hunter-gatherer communities and all other evolutionary species. With the advent of agriculture, Homo sapiens began the creation of a profit-driven, economically based way to sustain life. Unlike hunting and gathering that took place within Earth's natural ecosystems, a civilization began that was based on ever-growing cycles of economic interdependencies that took place outside of the planet's ecosystems and continue to do so to this day. As we will see, it is these profit-driven economic dependencies created within this emerging civilization that over time has stripped modern Homo sapiens of much of its freedom and ability to choose. Hunter-gatherers were economically free and self-sufficient without the need for economic growth, profits, wealth, or money, and they didn't need to destroy Earth's species and ecosystems to survive. Except for natural dependencies within the immediate family and the group, children on parents and elders on youngers, communal hunting, cooking, building shelter or making clothing, etc., they were mostly free of the kinds of economic interdependence that underpin modern civilization today. While they might have exchanged items, there wasn't any notion of owning, selling, or buying for a profit or to accumulate wealth. They hunted and gathered to meet all their immediate needs and freely shared with members of their group. While they no doubt learned from one another, they needed no formal schooling, college degrees, apprenticeships, training in any of the disciplines that are in vogue today, nor did they need to work for any employer to make a living. It was only after Homo sapiens began enclosing land for agriculture, domesticating animals, and then enslaving members of their own species, depriving them of the native economic freedom with which they evolved, did this economic dependency begin. Some call this civilization. But with this civilization came work, tilling the ground, irrigating the soil, planting and reaping crops, that often took the form of forced labor and slavery. Indeed, early images from Mesopotamia, among the earliest in the transition to civilization, are of slaves being marched along in neck shackles. Translated tablets show multiple lists of barley, war captives, and male and female slaves. The advent of civilization, then, was no great leap forward. Instead, it was nothing more than the first in a long series of methods the few, the ruling class and the wealthy, used to exploit the many, hijacking their freedoms and living off the labor and surplus grain of the first Homo sapiens peasant serfs. Except for modern Homo sapiens, no other species voluntarily chose or chooses to make a living by submitting itself in servitude to another. This loss of economic freedom created for the first time in our species' existence an economic dependency of one or more members on another in a way hunter-gatherers would never have known. That, in turn, led to exploitation, abuse, and slavery, and is way up there among the reasons 21st century Homo sapiens has lost so much of its freedom to choose. Here was the beginning of a civilization based on repeating layers of ever-growing cycles of economic dependencies, derived at first from surplus grain, but soon driven by growth and profits. Most anything one touches today arrives by way of a seemingly endless supply chain of interdependent contributors. Hunter-gatherers seemed to have mostly avoided becoming economically dependent upon anyone. They neither had nor needed market mechanisms in order to trade or sell surplus food for money to buy the items they needed. They were at once producer, manufacturer, distributor, retailer, and consumer, with no dependency on the intermediate and interdependent transactions that today come between one's needs and the fulfillment of those needs. Unlike a considerable portion of the 99% of 21st century Homo sapiens, they weren't dependent upon a paycheck from any employer, or social security check, dividend check, or interest payments from any government or corporation. They owed and paid no mortgages, rents, taxes, or utility bills, no tuition, car payments, medical bills, or insurance premiums, and best of all, they needed no savings accounts or retirement nest egg or tax havens to hide their wealth. They were a supply chain of one for all their needs, the beginning and the end of their own supply chain. Theirs was a level of economic independence and freedom most upper-income boomers and most of the 1% that hogs the world's wealth can't begin to dream of. Their economic wealth was rooted not in the massive financial holdings of a Bloomberg, Bezos, Buffett, or Gates, which can disappear and become worthless with, among other things, the collapse of Western civilization and the modern capitalist system it established, and that dominates 21st century economic life and civilization, but in their economic freedom. Their wealth and fortune was incalculable, but it was not stored in art or banks or bitcoins, neither in precious metals nor the tax havens of the 21st century global financial system, but in the ecosystems of the planet we seem to be working so hard to destroy. Bit by bit, as each new field, each new forest or wilderness was burnt and cleared for crops, hunter-gatherers were slowly forced farther and farther away, as more and more land was enclosed. Over time, confronted by habitat changes, species migration, or extinction brought on by climate change, many might have succumbed to farming themselves, or became landless peasants tied to the land held by rulers, priests, and the wealthy, while holdouts were forced to survive as hunter-gatherers do today, in jungles far away from what we call civilization. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, feudalism was well established in Europe and Japan, and most land had become the property of the king or government. For the first time, land and animals became property to be owned, and it was not long after, so too did the forced laborers, the peasants, and slaves. When capitalism eventually replaced feudalism as the major way to organize and manage the exchange of goods and services, this change to a globally interdependent economy and civilization really accelerated. Farming not only changed the way hunter-gatherers perceived and used land, but by slowly forcing them off the land, it separated them from the free natural food sources of the Earth's ecosystems, in which their economic freedom and independence was rooted. They were forced to become dependent upon farming, or wages from farmers and landlords and animal owners, for their subsistence. one can't help but notice the eerie similarity between the move to farming back then, the subsequent moves of colonial powers, and the current moves of multinational colonization today. What farming did to hunter-gatherers back then, European powers repeated upon poor nations across the global South during the European colonial period, from the 15th century to 1914, ending in some places as late as 1975. It is what multinationals do today to residents of towns, cities, states, and countries across the world, rob them of economic independence based on local natural resources, and often leave them economically ravaged and in political and cultural disarray, dependent upon a foreign power for aid or a multinational company for employment. During the European colonial period, when Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and several smaller countries established colonies outside Europe, according to David C. Corton in his book When Corporations Rule the World, paraphrasing slightly, these colonizers forced locals, who formerly obtained their living from their own lands and common areas, to give up their lands and instead to labor on colonial plantations to earn money to live. They were making them dependent on earning money so that their resources, labor, and consumption might yield profits for the colonizers, who required them to pay taxes in cash, thus forcing them to participate in a money-based economy. This pillaging of the peoples and countries of the global South, the breadth and scale of which is shown in the map below, was nothing short of a global heist by the few. The wealth of the global North today exists only because it was built upon wealth and resources stolen from the peoples and countries of the global South. These colonizers routinely declared all uncultivated lands the property of the state, thus denying local communities legal title to lands they had traditionally set aside as fallow, and to the forests, grazing lands, and streams they relied on for hunting, gathering, fishing, and herding. Next, vast tracts of forest were declared reserve forests. The right of access by locals was curtailed as the land was sold to European settlers or leased to commercial concerns for plantations, mining, and logging. European state-driven colonialism finally came to an end between the end of World War II and 1975, but by then, the economy, politics, and culture of all the enslaved countries were left in tatters. While few countries managed to escape being pillaged and robbed by the Europeans, and later the Japanese, few suffered as extensively as Africa and India, but more so Africa. While China and India, despite being colonized in whole or in part, still managed to remain largely one country, except for the partition of India to create Pakistan, the colonizers tore Africa apart, parceling it out amongst themselves, as the map below shows. Whereas China and India today consist of single nations, the continent of Africa is now made up of 55 nations. Small wonder this continent and its peoples continue to struggle economically, politically, and culturally from the ravages inflicted on them by the nations of the global North. But even as European, state-driven, exploitative colonialism was coming to an end, international corporate colonialism was just getting started. This time around, a new and different scheme to defraud these countries and peoples of their freedoms and economic resources was concocted. Economic development through foreign aid, investment, and trade. Instead of germ-laden missionaries peddling salvation, economists and colonial bureaucrats came peddling economic development, which in practice translated to, I want your natural resources, your cheap labor, the strategic advantages of your geolocation, among other things, and I will lend you money at rapacious rates and terms to extract your resources and export them to me at dirt cheap prices. This is colonialism with a different face: neo-colonialism. Methods of creating economic dependency among colonized peoples varied, but the results were similar. Find a way to alienate people from their traditional means of making a living, while creating economic dependence on money through work on plantations or in a company, in order to transfer power to an occupying country or corporation seeking to extract resources for its own exclusive benefit. People were pushed off their farms and became laborers on plantations and workers in factories. Countries became increasingly dependent on expensive foreign technologies and expertise, financed by foreign borrowing. Using money as the enticement, and multilateral banks and aid agencies to dictate the economic policies, and military assistance missions with clandestine political operatives to shape their politics. These multinational corporations expropriated the resources of these countries and penetrated their markets, according to Corton. Only if one has had the experience of growing up in the global South, in the middle of such a plantation, in a country similarly ravaged, can one know what the resulting economic, political, and human carnage looked and felt like. Thus, from the transformation some 10,000 years ago from hunting and gathering to agriculture, to European exploitative colonialism between the 15th and 20th centuries, and continuing into the 20th and 21st centuries, then on to corporate colonialism in the form of economic development, the few in the global North still continue to come up with novel ways to rob the rest of Homo sapiens of their economic freedom and independence, and thereby any say in their species' ability to choose survival over extinction. Like the enriched colonial powers that retreated to their homelands with their coffers full, leaving desolate their former colonies to pick up the pieces, today, as companies relocate to preserve or increase profits, abandoned employees get screwed and lose their livelihoods, and governments are left to pick up the cost of the human, social, environmental, economic, and political wreckage left behind. Multinationals, by closing factories, relocating jobs overseas in search of lower costs, and moving their earnings into international regions beyond the jurisdiction of any one nation-state in order to evade taxes, have had the same economic impact on Homo sapiens today that destroying ecosystems by slashing and burning forests, and clearing and enclosing the land for farming had on the livelihood of hunter-gatherers, and for all the same reasons. The tables have now turned, though, and multinationals, unlike the European colonists, are now pillaging their own and all other nation-states. They have become more powerful than most nation-states, and now set the rules of capitalism. And that's how the few and capitalism roll. Profits before people, money before life. Like